Welcome to another policy video from the Ontario 360 project housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Sean Spear. I'm the project co-director of Ontario 360 and a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm joined as always by my project co-director, Drew Fagan, who's also a professor at the Munk School. And today we're joined by Enid and Tomas Hachard, who are from the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance and co-authors of the new paper, Meeting in the Middle: How to Increase Cooperation and Get Provincial-Municipal Relations Right. We're honored to have them contribute to this Ontario 360 series, and in this case, co-produce this paper between Ontario 360 and IMFG. And we're pleased to have them here today to talk about the paper, its key findings, and its recommendations in the context of the upcoming election campaign and, of course, post-election transition. Enid, Thomas, thank you so much for your contribution and the partnership with IMFG, and of course, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Great, welcome. Let's go back a little bit and just to set the table. So Enid, Thomas, take us back to the origins of the structure of provincial-municipal relations, particularly in Ontario, and how it's evolved, because there's always been some concern as cities become more and more important, economically, socially, percentage of the population, they don't have enough powers. We can get to that in the structure and the relationship, but take us back to the origins and recent history as well, if you would, to set the table.
Well, thanks for the question, Drew. You're right, this does go back a long time. And just for your viewers, municipal governance, what are we talking about here? We're talking about what should the province be doing? What should municipalities be doing? How do we divide responsibilities between provincial and local governments? How much autonomy should municipalities have in delivering their services? How much intervention should the province do, if any? And an age-old question, do municipalities have enough money to do what it is they're tasked with doing? And are they structured? Do they have the right governance structures to deliver public services effectively? And we've been talking about these things for years. And yes, you're right, there is an historical foundation for municipal governance that goes back to before Confederation. It goes back to the Baldwin Act of 1849, which set out some of the responsibilities at that time for local governments, responsibilities like local roads, water, sewers, and the main revenue source to pay for these services was the property tax. And so municipalities continue to deliver those services and use the property tax to pay for them. But over time, municipal responsibilities have changed. And, we'll get back into some of these issues later. But municipal governments look a little different than they did in 1849. You may know this, you may not know this, but I was on the Who Does What panel in 1996. And I was in kindergarten at the time. But the purpose of the Who Does What panel was to clarify the responsibilities between provincial and local governments. And it was a very different approach than we have now. The approach back then was, we've got waste and duplication. The government felt we had waste and duplication because provincial governments and local governments were doing the same things, and they wanted to sort out those responsibilities. And one of the principles of that review was to separate, wherever possible, the responsibilities. So transit goes to one level of government, it's not shared. Water goes to one level of government. Social services goes to one level of government, provincial or municipal. We think differently about that now. I think we think that all these responsibilities are intertwined. And what we need is not to separate them, but actually to coordinate between the different orders of government to make this work. So in 1996, we kind of put some things, I don't want to say up to the province, we put some things to the province, some things to local governments. In 1998, the government did a local services realignment. The provincial government of Ontario did a local services realignment. Didn't exactly follow the Who Does What recommendations, but did put some things up and some things down. 1998 also saw a major restructuring of local governments. We brought in some regional governments, a lot of amalgamations. That's when the amalgamation of the City of Toronto happened, for example. And there was a major property tax reform in 1998. Following 1998, these issues were revisited because, these things evolve over time, and we think about them and they change. And so there was a feeling that maybe the social services that were downloaded onto the municipalities maybe shouldn't have been downloaded so much. Public health, interesting thing we can talk about more in the context of the pandemic, also was downloaded, and they started to bring that back up to the province. Go Transit came back up to the province. So some of the things that were downloaded in 1998 over the course of a number of years were uploaded to the province. So again, it's an evolving thing, right? You don't sort of, it's not set in time. You don't decide who does what and stop there forever. It's something that has to change over time as the economy changes, as we get pandemics, as we have climate change, and all of these things affect that division of responsibilities. And Thomas, I'm going to turn to you for the more recent history on the division of responsibilities.
Please.
Yeah, thanks, Enid, and thank you, Drew and Sean, for having us. Yeah, I think what we've seen in the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, is a continuation of what Enid mentions in terms of just how unstable this can be and how many changes you can see and how the relationship works. Starting with the end of the previous government and then the start of the current provincial government, what you saw was a little bit of a return to provincial unilateralism. Really, the provincial government had famously the veto on tolls that the City of Toronto wanted to implement on the Gardiner and the QEW, I believe, or the Don Valley Parkway. My apologies. They vetoed that proposal. In 2018, the province sort of more intensely had an incursion into municipal governance by changing the ward structure of the City of Toronto in the middle of a municipal election. At the same time, they canceled some regional chair elections that were supposed to take place in a few other GTA regional governments. You had a continuation of sort of unilateral approach in transit, at the beginning of this government's term, where they declared that they were going to upload the Toronto subway as part of a plan that they had for building many subways in Toronto and in Markham. Those plans upended years of work that that City of Toronto and TTC had been doing, and certainly the idea that they would upload the Toronto subway was a very unilateral approach to take on that in that case. And then in housing, what we've seen is a similar unilateral approach with ministerial zoning orders that they were using much more than previous governments, and which were quite controversial because it allows is projects to go forward in housing without going through the normal municipal sort of governance and regulatory approaches. So what you had is at the beginning, the province really stepping in and saying, we're going to take control of some of these areas where we think we know sort of what is best. What's interesting, though, is that what we've seen in the more recent few years is kind of a move to what we call in the paper sort of provincially led cooperation, because what we've had is in transit, for instance, there was this plan to upload the subway, which didn't go anywhere, and instead what ended up occurring was a memorandum of understanding between the province and the City of Toronto so that the province could go forward with its plans to build subways in Toronto and in Markham, while agreeing that some of the funding that the City of Toronto was originally intending for some of these projects could go to state of good repair. You've had, and I think in the last year or two, a plan to really reform social assistance, and this is one of those areas that, starting from the who does what panel into the local service realignment and going forward, has really seen a lot of fluctuation in terms of the municipalities being responsible and paying for it, being responsible for delivering it as well, the province taking over the funding of it, and you have this complicated relationship. And there has, and in a previous paper that Enid and I wrote with Gabriel Edelman for Ontario 360, we did say one of the key places that we should look at is social services in terms of rethinking who does what. And the province did say, we're going to look at this as part of this reform, and we're going to do it in cooperation with municipalities. And then what you've also on the housing front, to finish off, is what you've seen is, even as they were using ministerial zoning orders, and even as we have had recently this a task force recommend some pretty radical reforms to zoning that would really centralize responsibility, The government has moved a lot more slowly. They had a housing summit with the big cities to talk about how to approach housing. And when they've moved forward with legislation, it hasn't been to the more radical centralization, but it's been moving more slowly by saying that they want to work with municipalities, and you can't have one order of government doing this alone. So it's been an interesting move where we saw a lot of unilateralism at the beginning, and I think now a gradual understanding that cooperation is needed on some of these issues, and that you have to have the province and municipalities working together. And that's sort of what our paper, as we in terms when we move into the recommendations, suggests that we need to keep going in that direction, and that's what we hope to spur.
Well, Enid and Tomas, that is just an absolute tour de force. One of the things that we value at Ontario 360 is our ability to bring in area experts, and that answer just conveys the level of expertise that's housed at IMFG and reflected in this short policy brief. So thank you. Tomas, you described the evolution, even just within this particular government, to say nothing of the broader evolution that Enid outlined. I won't ask you to speculate on the cause behind the change in the government's approach, but what's the role of the pandemic in all of this? In what way did the pandemic force the government of Ontario to work with municipalities on delivering support and other services, given the structure of Ontario governance and the role that municipalities play in service delivery and other areas? So I guess, in other words, how much has the pandemic shaped the way that this particular government has had to manage this file? And are there any insights from the pandemic experience that may inform provincial-municipal relations going forward?
So what I would, just to start on this, and Enid, you can add, but my general thinking is the pandemic in some ways highlighted some of the tensions and some of the not the fragility in some cases of municipal finance in some cases. So on the one hand, you had the issue that a lot of municipalities, especially municipalities with large transit systems, ended up having large deficits or large shortfalls in their budget because people stopped riding transit. It's very dependent on fares, and you had to fill that gap. The province and the federal government stepped in to fill that gap over the course of time. It was a long negotiation, and at first it didn't seem it was going to happen, but eventually it did. But that, I think, highlighted there a need for cooperation. You did also have tensions. I think we have to remember that in terms of public health restrictions, there were certainly moments where the province was saying that this is the municipality's responsibility, and the municipalities were saying, well, actually, we don't have the power to shut down restaurants, and there was a lot of back and forth. And I think that was happening at the beginning, and over time, I think certainly it became clear that that's not a particularly good way to handle a public health crisis, is to be throwing responsibility around. So I think by highlighting those things in a very, in the middle of a crisis, it certainly, I'm only speculating, but it potentially could have shown that cooperation was a better way forward. I also, from my understanding, is that behind the scenes, certainly the AMO and the City of Toronto were working with the province quite closely and having meetings, and potentially, again, this is speculation, but potentially that also helped reinforce relationships that later led to more cooperation.
The pandemic didn't change things. It highlighted some of the tensions that already exist. And, in Canada, in our federal country, we always talk about the federal government has the money, the provincial governments have the powers, and the municipal governments have the responsibilities for delivering these services. And I think that really came to the fore during the pandemic, which is why you saw the federal government for the first time giving money to municipalities to address their operating deficits. We saw a lot of changes during the pandemic, but we also saw more cooperation, because I think, Tomas talked about public health and, just understanding the responsibilities of each order of government and what they can do and what they can't and who's responsible was very confusing. And I think that citizens didn't want a whole lot of fighting and bickering, right? Citizens just wanted to get those services, and governments understood that and tried as much as possible to cooperate. And I think, as part of your question, Sean, you said, what does this mean going forward? Well, we don't have a lot of formal structures for intergovernmental cooperation in Canada, not even federal provincial, let alone, federal provincial municipal. And so hopefully some of the cooperation that has gone on during the pandemic will kind of be more formalized going forward, so that when tensions arise, there is a table where we can have these discussions.
And that's really where you go in part with regard to your recommendations in the context of the challenges of fragmentation, if you like, paternalism, the constrained fiscal financial resources of municipalities, the lack of structure, and not just horizontal, vertical, if I could, but horizontal as well, in the sense of, think of the GTHA as the most obvious example here, and the size of that and the lack of adequate regional measures. Transit may be an example. So let's go, if we could, to the near term and the longer term suggestions you make to kind of, improve the structures to be more effective, and then sort of on the ground operations, if you would.
Yeah, happy to. And just to frame them, as you say, we do note these sort of 4 challenges that are sort of predate the pandemic in this government, but that if you are going to move towards cooperation, you sort of need to address. And I won't go through them in detail, but you mentioned, paternalism is one of them. We spoke about the sort of unilateral action and how that is really, it's not advisable from an accountability perspective, from a governance perspective. We talked about constrained finances and what municipalities have there, the lack of formal structures for coordination. And the last one, which we have talked about less, is fragmentation, because Ontario really is behind other provinces here in terms of having regional governance structures that cover an economic region and that allow municipalities to both coordinate in that economic region, but also coordinate in terms of having a unified voice if you're going to have cooperation between all levels of government. So those are the sort of...
Thomas, may I just interrupt just for a second?
Yes.
There? Just to reinforce that point, last week I was at a couple of sessions with Ipsos Public Affairs CEO Daryl Brooker, who of course spends a lot of time thinking about the suburbs. And he made the case that to understand the GTHA is to recognize that Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge are increasingly part of that ecosystem, as far as Niagara. And so, as you say, the need to sort of understand these issues from a horizontal regional perspective is just so fundamental.
Yes, yeah, and what COVID has done in part has actually led to some bottom-up solutions here, which is probably the direction we need to go in, is for the municipalities to take it on themselves to organize. And you've had weekly meetings by a group of GTHA mayors. We had the housing summit, which featured a small group of big city mayors meeting with the province. So our first near-term recommendation is really to solidify, to have the province recognize and encourage those steps that are being taken by municipalities. And frankly, as requested, as these things move forward, potentially delegate authority to some of these regional structures that get created for some things that really are better done at the regional level: transit, economic development, long-term growth planning. One of the things we point out in the paper is that it's not a coincidence that some of the areas where we see most tension, housing, transit, are places where it's really a regional solution that's needed. And by not having a regional structure, you end up either having the province step in, or municipalities potentially not being able individually to do it at the level that's required. And so potentially this regional solution could potentially lead to less tension and more cooperation. The second near-term recommendation we make is related more to the constrained finances problem. And what we've seen in British Columbia is that the municipal association there wrote a paper talking about the constrained finances that municipalities face there, and some potential solutions in terms of new revenue sources. And the province read that and sort of said, we're going to come to the table and we're going to do a formal review of municipal finance at BC over the next, I think it's over the next 2 or 3 years. And that is something that Ontario should take up. AMO here, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, have also done work in this area, and that could be used. And certainly research that IMFG and other places have done could be used to sort of spur that review. And we think that is something that would be very useful. And the last near-term recommendation really has to do with, as Enid said, trying to build on the cooperation that's been happening and begin to formalizing. In the long term, the long-term recommendations to make are really more about how to formalize and entrench them. But as a first step, what we think is it's really this housing summit that occurred is something that could be made into an annual event that could be given a secretariat and could be giving more support so that it creates, builds the muscles of cooperation there. And potentially we could do that with other policy areas where you have the need for cooperation, public health, childcare. We're going to see some real changes in childcare coming soon, and childcare is delivered at the municipal level. So how is that cooperation going to happen? So seeing some of this work will happen behind the scenes, but it's important to also have it happen, a bit more publicly and a bit more formally, so that we can, as I said, build those muscles of cooperation.
That's really great, Thomas. A good, I think, primer on the range of recommendations outlined in this paper. And I really like the near-term, long-term spectrum set out, and the fact that, as you say, these are recommendations that all of the major provincial political parties ought to be able to see themselves in. Maybe just to wrap up, Enid and Thomas, with a sort of big picture question. Where do you see the future of provincial municipal relations going in the province of Ontario? There are big fiscal pressures at all levels of government coming out of the pandemic, of course. The impact that aging demographics will have on public services, both at the provincial and municipal level. Are there any trends or models or approaches that you think may come to be reflected in the provincial municipal structure in the province of Ontario to kind of manage those pressures that are facing us?
Well, I would hesitate to say what I think will happen, but I'll say what I will hope will happen. Because I think the paper is really trying to suggest that if we're going to look at issues from housing to climate change, we're not going to get to a place where this former idea of airtight compartments between orders of government is going to work. Really, we've seen this in crises across the country. We've seen this in the floods in BC, where there was questions about who was doing the flood risk planning. We've seen in COVID in terms of public health restrictions. We've seen at the trucker protest in terms of policing. We see it in housing. Everywhere any crisis that comes has this jurisdictional angle that is attached to it, and that includes municipalities. And that is, I think, a sort of showing just how much municipalities are involved in policymaking. So my hope is that in terms of provincial municipal relations, it's that partnership, the idea that municipalities and provinces are partners in policymaking, in delivering the services that Ontarians need, is something that gets solidified. And our long-term recommendations are really ways to try to maybe entrench and formalize that fact. We talk about a ban on unfunded mandates, but which is maybe a negative way of putting it, but even a more positive way of putting it is signing an agreement, having legislation that suggests that if there are going to be fiscal impacts from provincial legislation on municipalities, that there needs to be consultation on that more formally. We talk about implementing procedures to avoid some of the more major incursions into municipal governance. So again, sort of build some trust that municipalities aren't going to have their decisions, or their board structures, for instance, just changed willy-nilly going forward. And that trust building through maybe those features is what leads to maybe our larger long-term recommendation. And what is my largest hope is that we're going to build some of these permanent, well-resourced intergovernmental committees where municipalities and the province can be at the table together. So some of these could be larger, with a general committee for the province, but some of these could be sectoral, like, policy issue by policy issue. And that we would have these be, there are, best practices in terms of making sure they have secretariats, making sure their meetings are frequent, making sure that, there's committees and working groups that support them. And if we could have a robust, intergovernmental structure between province and municipalities, I think that in the long term, that would lead to, better policy and better service delivery, because we'd have less of this, fighting and tension and pointing fingers.
If I could just end where we started in 1849 with the Baldwin Act, local governments, cities, municipalities don't look like they looked in 1849. They have changed a lot. And some of the recent things you talked about, Sean, changing demographics. We've talked about climate change. We've talked about policing. We've talked about housing. Like, these are big issues that municipalities are in the forefront of solving. And the question is, do they have the tools to do that? And I don't just mean the financial tools, but the powers to make these things happen. And so we're working on this at IMFG. We are working on a whole Who Does What series, where we're bringing in academics and practitioners to talk about what is the role of municipalities in housing, economic development, climate, policing, a number of different issues. We're doing this over the next couple of years to try to understand, in this changing environment, what municipalities are doing, what they should be doing, and what's the role of the other orders of government. So we're hoping to have input into that future for municipalities and their role.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up. But before we do, Enid, tell us, why don't you tell viewers where they can find not just that project, but all of the other great work that's carried out at IMFG?
Well, everything's on our website, monkschool.utoronto.ca/IMFG. And if you go there, you'll see the first paper in this Who Does What series, for instance, as well as a link to the paper that we've done with you and prior work we've done with Ontario 360 and much more. We have a large research archive that covers almost any issue you might want to cover with municipal finance and governance. So you can find it there.
Indeed, and viewers can also find the paper we've just discussed, Meeting in the Middle, How to Increase Cooperation and Get Provincial Municipal Relations Right, at our website, on360.ca. Enid and Thomas, thanks again for your contribution to this pre-election series and for today's conversation.